Welcome allesamen. And again, thanks to Andrew and Maddie for the introduction. And thanks to Vesterheim for providing me this opportunity. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here tonight to share some incredible experiences I've had kayaking in the Lofoten Islands of Norway. You'll be traveling with me to one of the most spectacular places in the world, a place that's often featured in calendar photos of Norway for its stunning, rugged beauty. As I often describe the Lofotens, you take the Grand Tetons and drop them in the North Sea, sprinkle them with patches of snow, little fishing villages, small farms, a few small cities, and add some touches of white sand beaches and aquamarine bays, and finally bathe them in 24 hours sunlight during most of the summer. It often seems surreal. I've had the good fortune to travel in these islands 3 times, once by bicycle and twice by kayak. Tonight, I'll be featuring my kayak trips, one in 2017 and the other this past summer. You'll see many photos. I like to let them do a lot of the talking, and it's easy to be at a loss for words as you're entranced by the magical scenery of the Lofotens. So here goes. We hope you enjoy the tour. First, just recapping a little bit of what Maddie was saying as far as some of my experience. Long connections in Norway, just that first experience at the International Summer School really made me fall in love with the country and all its ways of and opportunities it provided for friluftsliv and just the rich history there. Had so much fun working at the university. I wound up getting a job for a little bit with one of the regulatory agencies in Norway to extend my stay, and I've been back a few times. And again, I've done bicycle touring, hiking, skiing, whitewater kayaking, camping, just a lot of different things for my Norwegian experience. And then there's my kayaking experiences. I learned how to whitewater kayak when I was a freshman in college, and I've been doing that ever since, which now is up to 45 years, which seems hard to believe. And my favorite things to do are multi-day trips down spectacular places like the Grand Canyon. So maybe that's why I was drawn to the Lofotens. And I've been an instructor and been gradually picking up sea kayaking. Got a number of friends who are very much into it, and it's just a whole different sport, has its own thrills and just a sense of adventure. I've been a long time paddling clubs and an outdoor program. My motto: have paddle, will travel. So tonight's presentation, I'm going to be going over my 2017 trip, and then had a return there just this last summer. Little bit of time on trip planning, and then into some Q&A. So where are the Lofoten Islands? They are way in the north, and Norway is a long, skinny country. And there you see the Arctic Circle. So we're way along the coast there, not that far from Tromsø. And there's a detail of the islands, and it also shows the 2 routes that we traveled. So we were primarily in the easternmost large islands area, and experienced both fjords and islands, and you'll be hearing about both ways. And the main city there that we flew into is Svolvær, where you'll see kind of in the center there of the Osvagøy. So part 1, getting there. Here's 3 of us or 3 companions and I who traveled together. Here we're at the Oslo airport with all our gear. We had to bring all our own stuff except all our camping gear. Outfitter provided the kayaks and paddling gear. Part 2 is taking a little regional airplane up to the islands via Bodø. There we're getting our first glimpse of the islands as we're flying in. I think that captures things pretty well, just many little islands as well as the bigger ones and clouds. And here was our first evening there in the islands. We all were just taking this all in, and all the expectations, I think, were being realized in just one short order here. Clouds feature prominently in the islands. They can form their own source of entertainment, really. Just pretty amazing to watch them fall down over these mountains. Here's where we spent the first night, and this is one of the fishermen's cabins. The Lofotens were the center of the cod fishing industry in Norway, and so there are all these fishermen's cottages throughout the islands, usually on or very close to the seaside. They're rustic. They're called rørbuer, really literally row houses, come in all kinds of shapes and form, but it gives a good place to prepare for the launch. So we're packing up here, getting ready. Next morning, we had to load up our kayaks. We're traveling here for 7 days with a guide and had to get all of the gear and food and everything else into these boats. Finally, ready to launch here. There's my group. There were 7 of us plus the guide, all from Wisconsin. And there we're launching, and there's nothing like that feeling. My boat was so excited it even started going out by itself. But you see, the weather was a little less than perfect, but we were excited to get going anyway. And here our guide was giving us some early instructions. His name's Christian Louis Jensen, and he's an authentic Greenlander, which for those of you who are sea kayakers, the traditional style of kayaking is called Greenland style, and he's paddling a traditional Greenland stick, as it's called. He was just fabulous, knew the ins and outs of the islands, all kinds of great stories. And then here we're going by, we were paddling out of the camp past the city of Svolvær, and this was a monument called the Fisherman's Wife, which is to pay tribute to all the fishermen, many of whom didn't return after their fishing in those harsh conditions in winter sometimes. So it's a dangerous way to earn a living going out in boats about this size. These are a little bit more modern, but that's pretty much the types of fishing boats that would have been going out into the North Sea. For this is the dried cod. So those of you who love or loathe lutefisk, this is where it comes from. They hang it, salt it, and the temperature and humidity has to be just so for it to dry to the proper form. Here's a great illustration of the rørbuer, the fishermen's cottages. They're kind of like rustic hostels, so economical way to stay in the islands. Here we're just stopped by an old general store. Clearly now it's more of a tourist store, but it gives a good flavor of what it would have been like in the olden days in the islands. And then, speaking of the history, turns out that having some local connections are really nice because we were facing some more difficult seas the first evening out, and so we wound up camping in our outfitter's family property and just camping in this grassy area. The next morning, things were still not the best, but we're prepared for that, so we're heading down the fjord here. And if you've ever wondered what a salmon farm looks like, here you go. This is a set of salmon farm, the automatic feeders and these big deep nets are closed off at the bottoms. And there we're just heading down the fjord. Got some glimpses of some sunshine and blue skies early on, and that bird there is a sea eagle. They're like a big bald eagle, trained by this tour boat operator to come in when he is going down the fjord, brings some chum in for them to feed. Just taking a break at one of the little villages along the way called Digermulen. You'll see a little bit more of that later. But you see, this is the end of June and you see all the snow. So it's we're up there. And speaking of the local connections, some friend of Jan's this is the owner of the kayaking outfitter, and called him up and said, Jan, I think there's some of your kayakers going down the fjord. And so he drove across the island and met us for lunch. Really nice guy. And here we're going into Troll Fjord, which is the most heavily visited fjord in the islands and maybe much of Norway. It's a very spectacular place, as you can see here. But again, this is the end of June, right around the summer solstice. No shortage of water and just all these different sights to take in. This is how many people see the islands and much of the coast of Norway. This is the Hurtigruten boats. And traditionally, these are the cargo working boats that went up and down the coast from Bergen all the way to the North Cape. bringing goods, mail. And over time, they've kind of steered to be more tourist friendly, expanding the number of cabins and becoming more of a cruiser than just a cargo boat, but they still do that function. And the fjord's narrow enough that I swear this boat had a hard time turning around. It just seemed to make it. This is something that's wonderful about traveling and camping and encourages the Norwegian friluftsliv is that there's allemannsretten, which is every person's right, and you can camp and hike and go across public or private land. So camping is really never a problem. You just have to stay away from buildings and things, of course. So there we're camped right at the base of Trollfjord, just hanging out in camp, catching scenes like this. That wasn't photoshopped, it just happened. Woke up the next morning and saw this. And we were spending a little more time that day to wait for the tides and currents to be in our favor. So we did a little side hike up this side of the fjords to give us a little bit more of a view of it all. And the weather still wasn't cooperating very well. So this was going to be the third night in. We'd had 2 nights of rain and rain during the days. And I think our spirits might have been sagging a little bit. And our guide called up ahead to this camp and wondered if they had any cabins for rent. And no, sorry, we don't have any available cabins. But then the kind owner of the property, this nice old gentleman, said, well, you could just rent the community hall. So for a really modest fee, we rented this whole hall, which gave us this big open indoor space to spread out, dry out, take showers. And then Christian had a way with fishermen. He talked to a couple at the camp and asked them to borrow their fishing gear. And they said, well, here, we've got a bucket of cod. Here, have a couple. So we had this fresh cod, cooked it up just the way Christian prescribed it, and then had this wonderful feast. And finally, after the day 3, we did see a lot more blue sky and sunshine, which was great, which was a great relief. Not that we hadn't had a great time already, but it was nice to see the sun and some blue sky and dry out a bit. We are on the sea of all things, so it's always fascinating to a flatlander in a landlocked place like Wisconsin. Christian's luck with fishermen continued, and on this day, wound up carrying home a cod. And here are 2 ER doctors who had never cleaned a fish before. So they're getting a lesson in fish anatomy, which they're very fascinated with. And it made up for one really nice lunch on some good Norwegian bread. We were coming to an island where we were going to be camping, and we saw from a distance some large objects kind of moving around that we couldn't figure out what they were. And as we got close, well, we dubbed it Cow Island, and here's the welcoming party. We thought, well, they're pretty happy to see us. And it turns out it wasn't us, it's the salt. So we got our kayaks detailed by the cows. And Dennis of our group grew up on a dairy farm and part of a cheesemaker, and so he had to commune with his friends. Here's the midnight sun. This is the summer solstice. That's as low as it gets. And it bathes the area with this beautiful low light, makes for some really spectacular scenes. You see how well lit we are, and you see Dennis in front. This is midnight, and I think he fell asleep. But all right, and then breakfast, just cooking up some pancakes. One of the fellows brought some maple syrup, which isn't that common in Norway, so our guide really enjoyed that. The weather still had its moments. Again, we were wearing dry suits and all the gear, so we were fine. Cruising down this fjord with all this really spectacular topography here. It just never gets old. This was a nice little camp. Turned out there was this community teepee that was just available, first come, first served. So we camped here, and most of us slept inside here. There were some nice platform beds with reindeer hide. That's the original sleeping pad of very comfortable and warm. Got a nice night's sleep before packing up the next morning and heading on out. our guide had a girlfriend who worked in this restaurant in Svolvær, where this is going to be our last night in the islands. And so as we were going to be going by Svolvær, he kind of suggested, well, maybe we could just stop in and say hello and kind of happy hour. And we thought, sounds pretty good to us. So we paddled on in, walked on in dry suits, and you can tell you're in a maritime economy when no one even turned their heads with these people walking in, and just enjoyed a little of the local flavors. Short paddle home on a very beautiful evening. And this is a beautiful camp on this little inland bay. And it was the first night that it got a little chilly enough that we built a little fire, and it turned out we did have some frost in the morning. And here's what it was like. It just dawned, a spectacular day. And just before I go to the next slide, I got to give a little background. So this was a day I redeemed myself after a 37-year-old regret, is that when my wife and I bicycled in the islands, there'd been a day that was about like this, and I was about to go swimming, and I thought it'd be cool to say that I swam north of the Arctic Circle, but I don't know, for whatever reason, I chickened out. So I was regretting that all these years, and I even told Christian that story. And so I woke up, and he just kind of said, well, today's the day. And so I did. Had a nice little dip. It was refreshing, dunked a few times, so I think it qualifies. You can see we're packing up for this last morning out, always being mindful of putting our boats above high tide. Loading up, moving on out, and in the home stretch. And again, very nice seas against this backdrop of the mountains. Returning to our camp, one happy group in the sunshine. And that was really helpful for drying things out, cleaning up, rinsing off the seawater and all. So it's really nice to be able to pack up everything dry. And here you might recognize the camp again where we started and ended our trip. The summer solstice is right near St. Hans evening. Often traditionally everyone has bonfires on the beach, which when you're in 24-hour daylight isn't quite as impressive, but that was it. Here we're back at the Oslo airport, ready to go home. This is just one of my favorite sculptures from the Oslo airports. It used to be at the old one at Fornebu long ago. This is Gardermoen. All right, so the tour by the numbers, we spent 7 days paddling, covered about 83 miles. Longest day we had was 18 miles and spanned maybe 10 hours from the time we launched to the time we pulled into camp. Clearly not paddling that whole time, a lot of breaks and things. Water's cold, got to be mindful of the tides to be about 6 feet. We had some waves that were maybe 2+ feet one day. We didn't want to get into conditions much bigger than that. We had 5 days with some amount of rain, and there's the time, right? Again, centered around the summer solstice. We had this great group that did the trip with me, along with our guide. So really worked out well. All right, so jump ahead. So 2 of us from that trip had liked it so much, we decided, well, we need to do this again. So we started hatching another trip. I was, again, making all the arrangements and organizing it. And we had planned it for the summer of 2020. So we had to scrub it. And that was really disappointing. But we were committed to do it. So we had to wait till conditions would allow us to do it. And that wound up being until 2023. And there's just some shots of me getting ready. Here's stage 1 on this trip. Didn't show the airport this time. I had to show this over the top breakfast buffet at the Oslo airport where we were staying. I've seen a lot of breakfast buffets, but the Norwegians typically are eating pretty lean, cold cuts and cheeses and things. Pretty simple fare, but this thing just had everything. Flying in, you see again the islands, getting a glimpse already. The weather looks like it might be foretelling something different, although it can change quickly. But here's the islands. Arriving in the islands, there you see the backdrop of the mountains, and also keep in mind this airport. It's going to show up in a little bit later. Jan met us at the airport. there, showing us how the range of motion of his arm. He had some shoulder surgery, and so he wasn't going to be paddling with us. Here we're picking out our kayaks at his boathouse. There we met our guide, a fellow named Odd, and we're talking about the day that we're going to be launching and what our options are. Camp the night. Again, we're back to that same camp we'd used in the 2017 trip. Staying in the different cottages and lodges there. Some very traditional, kind of a mix of things. There's a very modern cabin. They have an RVs and tents. There was just quite a collection of different ways to enjoy your holidays. Then finally the trip begins, and you notice up at the top there, you might recognize that runway. We had some luggage delays, so we wound up, instead of starting at the camp, Jan drove us to this put-in. Packing up here, finally getting ready to launch. Again, there's nothing like that feeling after all that goes into getting to this point. So we're one happy group. That's our guide, Odd. And all smiles as we're getting ready to go. Here's our first camp. Very lush, with a nice view of his farm across the way. And it didn't take long for the spectacular scenery to start revealing itself. Just, you get spellbound. And with all that spectacular scenery, we also really lucked out in terms of flowers and foliage. There were these beautiful little orchids, and there were just flowers throughout the islands, many different varieties, just kind of a fantasy land. Also, it clearly gets a lot of precipitation, this very thick spongy moss and ferns everywhere. This moss was just truly like walking on sponges. And the trip really broke down into two parts. The first part, I'll call it island explorations. We're in the kind of far eastern part of the islands, where there are a lot of small islands versus the bigger ones are where the mountains are located. So we're exploring these islands, pulling into a camp like this. You notice the low tide there and all the kelp, which is kind of pretty, but it's also, when it's wet, it's really slick, which can be both depending on how you want to use it. Setting up camp in these lush fields, I really wouldn't have needed a sleeping pad. It was so soft. Just some scenes from around camp. Getting some lunch. Again, we provided our own food, meaning we bought most of it in country. One of our group members, Denise, brought a few dehydrated meals with us, which was really nice to have. But we just bopped into a grocery store and stocked up. Jan, the owner of the outfitter, once said when I asked him about providing food, he said, "No, you wouldn't want me to cook for you." So we were on our own, which worked out fine. And there's our group. First one or two nights in, I guess. Our guide again, Odd, he knew the island so well. It was kind of the level of, well, let's see, the wind's coming from the northeast today with the waves coming this way, and then the currents and the tides. And he would say, so with all that, the most protected, best beach and place to camp would be here, and would be, finding it. We had a lot of time to explore the little islands we were on, often climbing up to high points just to get some views, or in some cases, maybe to take an afternoon nap in the incredibly lush, spongy moss. Here was a delight. These are cloudberries in Norwegian called multebar. These are a real delicacy that they can't grow domestically, and people just treasure them and try to, they're trade secrets if they find a stash. They don't want to reveal where they found their cloudberries. But then you got to look up from the below and enjoy all these great island scenes here. Just go through see a few sailors in the islands. Not a lot of boat traffic. And sometimes you just got to set your paddle down when you're out and take it all in. And we did get on we had one big crossing where we were probably 2 hours straight paddling between landings. So that was maybe 5 or 6 miles. Clouds featured prominently both for entertainment and just making the scenes all that more dramatic. Just watch these come and go, always changing. It's hard to beat those kind of combinations. There's the camp, just really paradise. But then every once in a while, you got to phone home. It's one of our sharing the experience with his family back home, all there. And then this is how we'd start most mornings: is talking with Odd about our options. We wound up taking kind of a more leisurely approach, and one part of that was that there were 3 times where we just stayed at the same camp 2 nights in a row, which really was a great labor saver. Breaking camp and packing up is sometimes kind of a pain. So here we're out just doing day trips, exploring on the water. We had some incredibly glassy, smooth conditions. I wouldn't have ever imagined that we would have had 9 days with mostly these kinds of conditions. Never a problem with waves or wind. Did see quite a bit of wildlife. This is another sea eagle. Many other types of seabirds. We also saw a few porpoises and some jellyfish, both little ones and some pretty big ones. After a day of exploring the islands, so we're coming back to a ready-made camp, and that was a great feeling, especially when you're camped in a place like this. And it just begins the next day, and we're out. So here's some scenes from the water as we're paddling about. I know some of my whitewater friends might think that sea kayaking's kind of boring, but boy, I don't think I was ever bored. We were always very happy. Notice there's not as much snow, but boy, we really enjoyed the sunshine, I will say. And something I really enjoyed too was, despite being out on some big open water, we also were able to explore some side channels and things like this. And these were really fun to paddle down, see fish and things. And even with all these little islands, sometimes they make for nice break spots, but they can be a little bit difficult to find a good place to land. But we manage, and here we're just breaking for lunch. Notice the kelp there and where high tide would be versus where we are. And at the end of a day of paddling, it's just to kick back in camp and enjoy the low, beautiful light and all the scenery before you. And clearly, we stressed out Odd, our guide. He was just a treat, and he grown up in these islands, so again, he knew them like the back of his hand. We ate really well. Again, here we have the treats from the islands themselves: blueberries and cloudberries, which when you add to your morning oatmeal can make, and all the other things we had to add to it could really turn oatmeal into quite a gourmet, healthy way to start the day. Also, because we were buying our groceries locally, could buy some good Norwegian bread, which almost at any Norwegian grocery store, big or small, you can always get freshly baked bread. It's coming warm and wax paper wrappings, and that's a meal in itself. And this was a surprise. When we were at the base of Trollfjord, Molly of our group had noticed there were all these mussels that were exposed at low tide. So we decided, well, let's harvest some and let's add them to our evening pasta and pesto for a really gourmet backcountry meal. Jumping ahead a little bit, this was actually after the trip, but this shows some of the stockfish, as it's called, the dried salted cod, which is used for such treats as this. This is bacalao. This was the dinner after we finished at the restaurant in the camp. It's a Spanish-inspired fish stew that was super delicious. Now, the second part of the trip was all about exploring fjords. So we're at this camp, just waiting for to watch the boat traffic go by. First, we saw another Hurtigruten boat. And then this was a real surprise. Suddenly, we saw this Norwegian military sub cruising down the fjord. I'm not sure exactly their mission, but we waved and they seemed to be having a good time. Might be an interesting way to see the fjord. Here's the way most tourists see the fjord, other than the Hurtigruten, the bigger cruiser boat, and then these really fast boats that just zip down the fjord and don't really seem to spend that much time enjoying it. So seeing the fjord by our much slower paced, more intimate boats, I think is the way to go, at least for our group. So here we're paddling in the Troll Fjord. Again, took a little side hike up this to get some views. It was a little bit rainy, but ultimately it was a pretty nice day. You get to feeling pretty small up in these fjord country when you're by these huge cliffs and everything is such grand scale. This is one of our last camps. It was forested, so we had the chance to be able to collect some wood and build fires. Weather we had was cool, but not very comfortable. Fires were nice to have, I will say. There's a very happy hour. That was kind of a routine at the end of the day. It's getting together, really fun group. And this is exploring the last big fjord of the trip. It's called Ingels Fjord. It's actually a much deeper, longer fjord than Troll Fjord, much less visited. And as we start, this was kind of a magical part of the day, is that it started out with very cloudy. And then as we were paddling into the fjord, the clouds seemed to be lifting as if a curtain was being lifted. And patches of blue started coming out in the sun. And then I just kept getting to be much clearer. And the sun was just spectacular. And here we are getting towards the end of the fjord, taking a lunch break. Saw some more mussels. So we decided, well, it worked once, let's get some more. So we're harvesting some mussels there. Forever reminded that we're in the sea. Some sea urchins everywhere. And then as we paddled out, the clouds started falling again, as if the curtains are closing. Still made for some really nice paddling. Some spectacular views again, little farms all over. Glassy seas were forever fascinating. Our last camp, the sandy beach, just kicking back and enjoying the view. And we were also entertained by some locals. These Arctic terns were incredible aerial acrobats, and they would dart around, hover, and then just dive bomb for some of the little fish that would be up along the surface. This nice little birch forest behind at this camp. Well, happy hour again. We're getting towards the end of the trip. We're all in pretty good spirits. Everything's been working. Nice overlook of the kind of camp we had there last night. Some views from the island. Puffins are famous for being in the islands. They're more and the seabirds are more towards the western islands. But I did come across this one, sadly. But I mean, that happens. But they're there. Our beach at our last camp, looking back at the mountains. And this is something I really enjoy about paddling in Lofotens compared to maybe some trip in a true wilderness area where you're not really touching civilization at all once you launch. Here we're going in and out. This was a place we had paddled to get to refresh with water. Pulled in. It's an old fishing outpost at one of the islands that was near where we were, and well, we got a little bit more than water, but it was too good to pass up. And there was a charming Polish bartender there, and he was telling us some good stories. And they had a simple menu, so we got a little bit of food there too, and just enjoyed the evening. Going again in 24-hour daylight, the view from the patio, can't help but toast our good fortunes. Here's another place that was very charming. Little grocery store and cafe, famous for cakes. So we had to check it out. And this was truly decadent. The Norwegians have such wonderful desserts, I swear. These cream cakes and chocolates and berries. It was delicious. This is Digermulen. We'd been there before. This is a ferry. This is that community hall where we had sought refuge on that first trip. And here we're just filling up with water and taking a little break as we're paddling down that same sound, waiting for the tide and the current to be a little more in our favor, not as strong. Some of the farms in the area here. So now we're getting to Trail's End. Last day of paddling. Couldn't have picked more perfect weather for a last day. And no, we didn't just jump to Fiji. This is more part of the islands and just showing how lush they can be and this crazy emerald green waters that happen. Enjoying our last lunch. And here's the end of the trail. We pulled up to this beach where Jan and one of his staff met us to load up. Head on back to the camp. Here's the inevitable gear explosion. Molly and Denise had a plane to catch that evening, so they were especially scrambling to go from paddling mode to airport travel mode. Then you notice that it's looking pretty nice and warm there. And so the locals were all enjoying the water, a lot of kids in the water swimming. And I decided, well, I swum here once, I'm going to go again. So I had another nice swim. Here are a few parting shots the morning that we left. Hard to imagine water that still, but. And here we're flying out. Some more parting shots. It just doesn't seem real at times. And that's our route. We didn't do a loop route this time. We got picked up and drove back. Where the earlier trip we had actually ended where we started it. But again, we spent more time exploring some of these islands way in the east there that were much more open and the weather was cooperative to enable us to do that. This trip was a little bit longer. We spent 9 days paddling. Covered 95, I guess maybe rounded up to 100 miles. We didn't go as long on any given day. 14 miles was our longest. Didn't spend as much time on the water either, maybe 6 hours. I think the water was a little bit warmer, which probably made the swimming a little less bracing. Again, tides are about 6 feet. We didn't have much for waves, at most 1 feet one day. And days with rain, 0. We had a few sprinkles at night. And again, this was a month later than our earlier trip. Had this great group again. Only two of us had done the earlier trip, so the rest were all new to this. All right, so just to wrap up here a bit, just on trip planning, given the 2020 cancellation, this trip was 4 years in the making. So there's a lot of buildup and a lot of anxiety and a lot of pieces to put together twice. So all the different moving parts, it's chartering our trip with the outfitter, finding the schedule that works, had to recruit some group members. There's the international travel. We did it in kind of 2 parts where everybody made their own arrangements to get to Oslo. And then from Oslo, we traveled as a group. There's lodging before and after. There's the gear, camping gear, food, communications, and then contingencies, the what ifs. But all that persistence and patience paid off for a really good trip. The parts came together and worked. And on this trip, especially, the weather cooperated. Here's some resources. Our outfitter is the author of this one book about paddling in the Lofoten. So he literally wrote the book. Very detailed, and that's his company there, Lofoten Active. Maps are handy. These 2 maps pretty much cover most of the islands. And this map just gives a little glimpse into all the tiny islands and the bigger ones and just how complex this all is to be traveling in. So we were so happy we had a guide. Initially, we thought we might rent kayaks and do it on our own, but it was such a wiser move just for that local knowledge and everything that goes with that. So just closing thoughts on kayaking in Norway for any of you interested in doing it yourself. It's really become very popular. I think you can find kayaks for rent and day tours or any kind of tours throughout the country, whether it's the Western fjords or rivers or lakes. So lots of possibilities, and that's possibilities for paddlers of all abilities and skill levels. You don't have to be a highly skilled paddler. I'm sure you could find, if you've never dipped a paddle before, I think you could find a trip that would work. And I'd highly recommend guided tours just for the safety and ease that affords you, plus that local knowledge that can come in so handy both to enrich the trip and then handle anything that comes up. If you are do have experience and are looking at renting, it turns out you need to have some credentials. I'll just leave it there. There's different ways to get that. And just matching your skills and experience level to what you want to do on the trip. We clearly had some more ambitious goals of camping and spending a lot of time in the water, but I think just an afternoon or morning day trip would be just wonderful, and go from there. And I just happened to notice that on the website Visit Norway, they've got several pages on kayaking and canoeing, and they list some guides and place links for more information. So some Google searching will certainly reveal what you need to. And actually, that's how I found Jan and Lofoten Active. So with that, tusen takk for your attention, and we're now going to open it up for questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dan. Oh, stunning, stunning photos. We are going to open up the floor to questions at this point. Please use the Q&A function to submit your questions. Maddie and I will go back and forth with Dan and do our best to pose as many as we can in the next 5 or 6 minutes. One question that I saw go by earlier in the chat was about what time of year you went. And you shared during the presentation, one of the trips, the earlier one was in June and the second one was in July. Yep. Is there a window of month that kayaking trips feel like a good idea versus a bad idea for those who are interested in going?
Sure. For the Lofotens, I think that window is June into August. Earlier in June can probably be even a little iffier. You notice that our trip in June, the third week there, solstice, still saw snow up in the mountains, and clearly we had more rain, but that's a roll of the dice. We could have had very equally spectacular weather, but July seemed a somewhat safer bet for weather. August can be good, but then once you start getting into fall, I think the weather can start turning foul, and what's especially of concern are the wind and waves if you're out in sea kayaks and are exposed. So yeah, there's a window of time in there.
Great. Maddie, do you want to pass Benjamin's question on?
So Ben Ho from your 2017 trip is asking if you changed anything in regards to planning in 2023 based on what you learned from 2017.
Oh, good question. Hi, Ben. I think the main difference was we did pretty much everything the same, but we did bring some initial food with us. The first trip, we bought everything in country. We thought we'd be packed heavy enough as it was. This time, because it was a little stressful then buying food initially, I was the only one who knew Norwegian, so the 7 of us going around a Norwegian grocery store, and my head's kind of exploding with everybody asking, "What's this? What's this?" So this time, Denise of our group does a lot of dehydrating food, so she had brought 4 dehydrated dinners ready to go. So it took some of the pressure off of having to buy absolutely everything. But other than that, we did pretty much things the same. I think we had a little different. We weren't as concerned with distance. Not that we were that concerned with distance the first time, but I think we just naturally fell in a little bit more leisurely pace, covering less distance, spending more time on land. But overall, I think I did a lot of the same things.
I know for many kayaking trips, bugs can be an issue. And Deb asked in the chat, what did you do to prevent bugs disrupting your food?
Sure, that's a fair question. And being from Wisconsin, we're well aware of bugs. Actually, there was, I think, just one night where there were a little bit of mosquitoes, but which really bugged our guide much more than any of us. We were like, this is nothing. So, we were ready for bugs. We all had tents with screens and whatnot. And I think we all probably had some bug repellent in our packs, but I never used any, and I was never really bothered by them. So surprise! It's not that you can't get bugs in Norway, so I wouldn't say that's a universal um, free pass. But generally, that they haven't. Norwegian houses don't have screens in them generally, so bugs just aren't the same as they are here in the buggy Midwest.
Wow.
The small farms that you passed while paddling, do you know if they were actually functioning family farms?
I think many of them still could be. The Norwegian government, let's face it, they really want to support people across the country, and they don't want the countryside to be vacated. And so I think farmers get a fair amount of subsidy. Norway's a very oil-rich country, so they have a little more money to play with in their national trust and whatnot. I think I read a statistic one time that the average dairy farm in Norway now is only like 12 cows. So they are kind of almost hobby farms by our standards. But I think they are still working to a degree, and maybe some of them have become more VRBOs or lodges or things. But I think those cows that we met were being milked and producing some of that good Norwegian cheeses.
Fabulous. Carrie is commenting that your pictures were amazing, and I totally agree, Carrie. She's wondering, what type of camera equipment did you travel with?
Okay. I had 3 ways to shoot photos. I've got a little point and shoot waterproof camera that I keep on a leash in my life jacket that I can easily pull out and just take pictures, and it takes them surprisingly well. And I usually have to do more photo editing on those back on my computer, but it allows me to get pictures that I otherwise wouldn't, because I can just do it so much on the fly. And then I did a lot more with my iPhone this time around. I'm finding that really takes good pictures, and it's so easy. And then I do have a little travel zoom camera that I used for some of those. It's got a really long zoom capability. So my philosophy is traveling light with cameras and kind of grab and go. I don't spend a lot of time fussing for photos, even though I used to do a lot of that and would drive my wife crazy. So I'm reformed.
Excellent.
But, it's so hard to take a bad picture there, because the islands the photos just happen, as you just saw.
Yeah. And then there's another logistics question. Did you carry cash with you, or were credit cards accepted in most places, even in the rural areas?
To be honest, I got some cash initially just because I'm kind of old school, and I thought I need to have some kroner in my wallet. And actually, I only used the cash at the end of 3 weeks, taking a taxi to a train station, just because I had to burn it up. Otherwise, it was complete credit cards, everything from buses to coffees to dinners and drinks, whatever. It was all credit card.
You said that most Norwegians speak English, but it sounds like in the store there was a little bit of a language barrier. Do you think that the folks in the more rural areas speak more Norwegian than English?
The language barrier in the stores is more just figuring out what's in the package, and you get a lot of cues from graphics and pictures on the packages. And having lived a year in Norway, I kind of knew what to look for. Language. Yeah, most Norwegians know English. Some of them aren't so comfortable speaking it always. And I think it is true that if in the more of the rural areas where they don't have as many tourists and don't have as many chances to speak English, they're a little shy about that. So it's handy to know some Norwegian. I know I had learned it pretty well 30 some years ago, and mine's pretty rusty. So I sort of know enough to be dangerous, where I start speaking it and then they think I really know it, and then they bury me. And the dialects are really strong too. Our guide spoke a very northern Norwegian dialect, so he would kind of lose me. But on the other hand, he also realized I could understand some of what he was saying, so he had to watch what, didn't insult us in Norwegian or anything.
All right, I think we have time for just one more question. If somebody wanted to plan their first kayaking trip, is the Lofotens the right place to go? And how do you train leading into it?
I would say that Lofotens would be a place you'd want to have a little more experience paddling, because I think we lucked out, as you saw, where we had such ideal conditions, but we are out on the North Sea and things can get rough quickly. So I probably wouldn't recommend them. Although it might be possible to arrange a trip in much more sheltered parts and stay away from the exposed side. So it might, it's possible. But I think some of the Western fjord country, some of those fjords are really quite protected, not nearly as exposed. And so some of those little coastal towns, I'm guessing these days you can find a kayak outfitter that does half day, full day kayak tours guided. And a lot of those outfitters tend to use tandem kayaks, which are more stable than solos. And these days they're sit on tops that you're not sitting down in a cockpit with a skirt on or anything. That kind of freaks people out, the thought of being upside down with a skirt on. So there are very beginner friendly ways to get out paddling. And a good guide would always keep you safe. They're not going to take you out in conditions that would be hazardous.